They called him a god, a ruler of the known world. But history remembers him as a monster. In the glistening palaces of ancient Rome, under the golden dome of unchecked power, there lived an emperor whose desires defied morality, reason, and even nature itself. He was worshipped by the masses, feared by his senate, and hated by his people. And yet, when his wife died, he mourned her not like a grieving husband, but like a deranged predator who couldn't bear to lose his favorite possession. So what did he do? He found a young boy, he cut off his genitals, he dressed him in silks, he made him his new bride, and he called him Papa. This is the story of Nero, Claudius Caesar Augustus, Germanicus the man who ruled an empire but couldn't control his madness, and of Sporus, the unfortunate boy who was dragged into one of the most twisted relationships in all of history. Who was this emperor? Born in 37 AD, Nero wasn't originally supposed to be emperor, but through a web of political marriages and blood-soaked ambition, his mother Agrippina managed to push him onto the throne at the age of 16, raised on poison and paranoia, worshipped her, adored her to the point of madness. To understand the depravity of what happened, we must first understand Nero himself. At first, Nero was a somewhat capable ruler, but that changed, slowly then all at once. Others claim he was drunk and paranoid. Whatever the reason, Nero kicked her in the abdomen. She collapsed, her unborn child died. She died soon after. He killed his own mother, supposedly after multiple failed assassination attempts. He burnt Christians alive in his garden parties. He sang while Rome burned literally and forced nobles to applaud his dreadful musical performances on pain of death. His name became synonymous with cruelty, excess, and insanity. She was considered one of the most beautiful and cunning figures in Nero's court. At first the mistress of another man, she climbed her way to power and into Nero's bed, a shell in which he could pour the image of Poppaea again. But Sporus wasn't just dressed up in women's clothing. Nero went much further, but her ambition was matched only by her ability to manipulate. She knew what Nero liked and she gave it to him. But even among the thousands of stories about Nero's horrors, one stands alone in its sheer grotesqueness. His marriage to a castrated boy, with a dowry, with a veil, with all the rituals of a Roman wedding. The death that broke the beast. He paraded him through the streets as Poppaea Augusta, kissing him in public, calling him empress. Poppaea Sabina was no ordinary woman. This was psychological necromancy, a desperate, deranged attempt to resurrect the dead through mutilation and delusion. She became his empress, and for a time Nero was obsessed with her. But like all obsessions, it turned deadly. A child caught in the blood-stained jaws of imperial madness. One night, while she was pregnant with Nero's child, he flew into a rage. Some say she criticized him. Nero had killed the only woman he ever truly loved. How Nero treated him in private and what unspeakable fates awaited the boy after Nero's suicide. Because even after the monster died, the nightmare didn't end, and he couldn't live with that. He needed her back, at any cost. It wasn't too long after Poppaea's death that Nero discovered someone in his court, a young boy, a slave, barely into adolescence, who bore an uncanny resemblance to the woman he had murdered. His name was Sporus, delicate, soft-featured, feminine in form and voice. Nero saw him not as a person but as a vessel. He ordered the boy to be castrated, a brutal operation that in those days often led to death from infection or blood loss. But Sporus survived, and then Nero married him.
Yes.
In front of witnesses. In a public ceremony, the emperor of Rome married a eunuch boy and called him his wife. This wasn't love, and he had no say, he was a slave. And yet, the horror was only beginning. In the next chapter, we peel back the velvet curtain of Rome's darkest fantasies. How Sporus lived as an empress, to be continued. He had no throne, no bloodline, no title, yet the boy walked beside the emperor as if born into power. But he wore not a crown of gold, he wore a crown of silence and fear. After the grotesque wedding ceremony that shocked even the jaded nobles of Rome, Sporus found himself elevated overnight. Once a mere slave, now he was called Augusta, the title of empress. Always introduced as Pop. When the crowds gasped, Nero smiled. When senators looked away in disgust, he drank in their discomfort like wine. To him, this was love, art, a performance in which he was director, actor, and god. Dressed in royal silks, adorned with pearls and gold, he was paraded across the empire like a living doll, a puppet with dead eyes. Nero wasn't content to keep this illusion behind closed doors. He flaunted it. He took Sporus to public events, banquets, theaters, gladiator games, always dressed as a woman. His manhood had been taken, his identity erased. What remained was an empty shell shaped into Nero's fantasy. And Sporus, he smiled when told, walked when commanded, sat quietly when Nero whispered the dead woman's name in his ear. But behind that painted face, behind the mascara and jewels, was a boy with no escape. He recreated their life together with Sporus as the vessel. The boy was forced to sleep in her bed, wear her favorite perfumes, mimic her voice, her laugh, even her mannerisms. He didn't care. a scene he forced Sporus to reenact with him again and again. One by one, senators and generals turned on him. Governors in the provinces began to rebel. Even the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers sworn to protect him, were losing loyalty. It wasn't a relationship, it was possession. A haunting, a grotesque resurrection. "She still lives," Nero would whisper. "Look, do you not see her eyes?" The streets of Rome, once echoing with his praises, now chanted for his death. His allies fled. His palace gates were abandoned. Inside the palace walls, things were far more horrifying than the public could see. Nero's obsession with the memory of Poppaea turned monstrous. Perhaps he had nowhere else to go. Perhaps fear chained him tighter than any collar. Or perhaps he thought, foolishly, that in Nero's ruin, he might finally be freed. Historians suspect that Nero called him wife, even in private. But Sporus was a eunuch not by nature, but by force. If he couldn't rule Rome, he wouldn't let Rome see him beg. And this fantasy came with a price. The empire around them burned. But inside the palace, Nero was building a tomb for the living. He begged a servant to help him, and as the blade sank into his neck, as the last breath gurgled from the man who had once ruled the world, one figure stood nearby. But Rome was losing patience. The people were starving. The treasury was empty. Nero's games and lavish spectacles could no longer hide his cruelty or his madness. And Nero, he was too busy rehearsing a new play in which he would perform as a grieving widow. It was more than madness, it was decay, used as a political symbol, and ultimately faced a fate perhaps even crueler than death. The empire was crumbling, and Nero was painting masks. By 68 AD, the tide had turned completely. The Senate declared Nero a public enemy. Only a few remained with him in those final hours. One of them was Sporus. Why didn't he run? Instead, he witnessed the death of an emperor. "What an artist dies in me." These were Nero's final words. Trapped in a decaying villa outside the city, surrounded by whispers of betrayal and the echo of approaching soldiers, Nero made a choice. With a trembling hand, he lifted a dagger to his throat. But even in death, he could not act alone. A boy in a woman's robe, staring silent, unmoving, Sporus had watched his tormentor die. But the nightmare ... had not ended, because Rome would not let Sporus go. In Part 3, we will uncover the chilling aftermath, how Sporus became a living trophy passed between power-hungry men. Because in ancient Rome, surviving the monster didn't mean escaping the darkness. To be continued. When the monster fell, Rome didn't blink. But one boy stood in the shadow of his corpse, still wearing the veil of a dead woman. Nero was gone, slain by his own hand, abandoned by his empire. The Senate declared a new age. The statues of the tyrant were toppled. His name was spat upon in the streets. But there remained one strange, silent reminder of the nightmare that had been. A boy, not yet 20, dressed in the silks of an empress. His name was but Rome knew him only as the ghost of Poppaea. And what do men do with ghosts in times of war? Generals battled for the throne like rabid dogs fighting over meat. In the chaos, Marcus Salvius Otho rose to power. He had once been a friend and perhaps a rival of Nero. And like Nero, he had once been married to Poppaea or Sabina herself. They turned them into tools. From one emperor to another after Nero's death, the empire fractured. Once more, he was addressed as Augustus. Once more, a man crowned himself emperor and declared Sporus his wife. So when Otho seized control, he took Sporus as his own. Yes, again, once more, the boy was paraded in imperial robes. It defied belief. It was madness layered on madness, but it served a dark logic. To some, it was an act of devotion, twisted love from Otho to Poppaea's memory. To others, it was political theater, a message to the Senate and to Rome. I am the heir of Nero's legacy. I possess what he cherished most. And to it was yet another prison, the empress of a dead empire. He saw a joke, a grotesque souvenir of a regime he wanted to bury. He had endured pain beyond measure, humiliation beyond comprehension, and still, the world refused to see him as anything more than a shadow. By now, Sporus was no longer a boy. He had grown into a quiet, haunted young man. At banquets, Sporus was seated beside him in the place of an empress. In ceremonies, he stood veiled and silent. Guests whispered, some in horror, others in awe. Otho, though less violent than Nero, still used him as a symbol, not a person. But even this new chapter was short-lived, would be shattered completely. In the middle of the arena, Sporus would be violated in front of thousands. A parody of imperial marriage, a mockery of Nero's madness, a message to all who still dared to whisper the tyrant's name. Otho's reign lasted only 3 months. The details are unclear. Some say poison, others say a knife. The historians do not linger on the method. And then came the third emperor in less than a year, brutal, vengeful, and filled with hatred for all things Nero. When Vitellius rose to power, he found Sporus still in the capital, still dressed in the garments of a woman, still whispering the echo of a name that refused to die. Vitellius did not see a person. And so, he made a plan. He announced that Sporus would be executed, but not by sword, not by poison, by rape, public rape. the final humiliation. It was to be a spectacle, one befitting Rome's most debauched cruelty. He was not the villain, not the monster. He was the mirror showing Rome exactly how deep its sickness ran. The audience would cheer, the emperor would laugh, and Sporus, who had been forced into the role of bride, of empress, of ghosts, he had survived Nero, survived Otho, survived Rome itself, but this he would not survive. So he chose the only escape left to him. Before the day of the spectacle, Sporus took his own life, because Rome had already forgotten him. To the empire, he was a curiosity, a stain, a footnote in the madness of empire. But in truth, he was something else entirely. A child mutilated by power, a soul reshaped into fantasy, a person erased, rewritten, and discarded. 3 emperors married him, none ever saw him. Sporus lived as a phantom of desire, a breathing corpse dressed in silk and lies. His story isn't just shocking, it's a warning. In part 4, we'll delve into the terrifying culture that allowed this to happen, how Roman society turned cruelty into spectacle, how eunuchs were both fetishized and enslaved, and how emperors weaponized the human body as theater. Because Sporus was not alone, and the empire that destroyed him, destroyed many. To be continued. They called it civilization, but behind Rome's marble columns and golden temples, there beat a heart made of fire and knives. To understand how Sporus' story could happen, we must first understand the stage upon which it was performed, because ancient Rome was not just an empire, it was a theater. And the audience, hungry for blood. When cruelty became culture, the cheers were deafening, the laughter louder. In the Roman Colosseum, 50,000 people would gather to watch men be torn apart by lions, slaves forced to kill one another, prisoners burned alive in reenactments of myth. Rome didn't just tolerate violence, it worshipped it, and the line between entertainment and execution blurred until it vanished. It was Rome using the human body, vulnerable, bleeding, screaming as a message to the world. This is what happens to the weak, to the conquered, to the disobedient. When Vitellius planned Sporus' rape and death as a public spectacle, it wasn't madness, it was tradition. And in that culture, the most dangerous thing a person could be was beautiful. The politics of castration. Many emperors surrounded themselves with castrated boys not as equals, but as playthings, decorations, shadows of desire that could never threaten their rule. Eunuchs were a paradox in Roman society, reviled, yet desired, humiliated, yet entrusted with intimate power. Castration wasn't just punishment, it was transformation, a way of erasing identity, masculinity, and independence all at once. He staged them, invited witnesses, forced senators and nobles to watch as he acted out dramas with Sporus playing puppet. It was dominance. The emperor was more than ruler, he was the ultimate actor, and his victims were props in a twisted script of submission and spectacle, a final act of humiliation that turned real pain into state-sponsored performance. To mutilate a boy and dress him as a woman was to assert absolute control over his body and his soul, and no story illustrates this more gruesomely than Sporus. Between theater and torture, because he wasn't just a eunuch, he was a construct, a walking illusion, built by Nero's grief and Rome's apathy. He became Papaea, then he became a warning, then he became disposable, Caligula, broken and reshaped into living dolls. Others lived long enough to serve new masters. The mad ruler before Nero, beauty too dangerous too. We'd bring this journey to its close. We'll reflect on Sporus' legacy, how history remembers him, and why this grotesque tale still matters in our world today. Servia was rumored to have made his horse a priest and slept with his sisters. Beauty wasn't a gift, it was a curse. It wants to rule flesh. Another future emperor, too soft, too different, especially as a slave meant you could become a Sporus, a puppet, a symbol in someone else's nightmare. Would host banquets where he tossed gold and had naked slaves serve guests on all fours. He too surrounded himself with effeminate boys, castrated, painted, and silenced. Performance's power was a symbol wearing a veil, and whispering through the cracks of history, of Rome's ultimate sin, the destruction of identity in the name of power. He wasn't even a victim in the eyes of the empire. Nero didn't hide his perversions behind curtains. This wasn't shame. In Rome, even Sporus' mock execution was meant to be a kind of play, a parody of marriage. Rome blurred the line between bedroom and battlefield, and the audience kept watching. Sporus was not alone. Other emperors had their own human ornaments. Rome's elite households often kept pueri delicate boys for sexual use, chosen for their looks, bought as slaves. Some died young, but all of them were reminders of a truth Rome rarely admitted. Power is not satisfied with ruling nations. In a world like this, to be too lovely, Sporus wasn't a lover. He in part 5, because sometimes the past isn't dead. It's dressed in silk, to be continued. His name was Sporus, at least that's what the records say. But even that name, was it truly his? Or just another mask forced onto a child who never had a choice? But when it came to Sporus, the silence is almost total. The Roman Empire recorded everything: battles, speeches, tributes, laws, even the dreams of There is no tomb, no statue, no letter, no final words, just whispers in the margins of imperial chronicles, a footnote in the monstrous theater of Nero's life. And maybe that was the final cruelty, not the castration, not the mock marriage, not the threat of public execution, but the erasure. Sporus remains a backdrop, a symbol of someone else's madness. Cassius Dio describes the marriage with clinical disgust. Tacitus barely touches the name. Not one of them wondered who the boy was before it all began. Not one asked if he cried when it happened, or if he prayed for it to end. History remembers him only when it needs to remember Nero. Suetonius, the imperial biographer, writes about Nero's madness and mentions Sporus only to highlight his former master's depravity. Even today, when Sporus is mentioned in classrooms or books, it's not his story being told. Was a soul, but behind the symbol, what was stolen was his humanity, his right to be seen as anything more than an object of lust, or a punchline in political tragedy. A machine that turned bodies into tools, and names into echoes. Sporus was one among thousands, slaves, eunuchs, prisoners, women whose fates were bent, broken, and buried under marble floors. What was taken from Sporus more than just his body, more than his identity. He was forced into a woman's role not because he identified as such, but because power demanded a shape to mold. He was turned into a reflection not of who he was, but of who others wanted to see. The empire did not just crush, it rewrote him. But in that silence, we see Rome for what it truly was. Rome was not just senators and sculptures. It was fear, spectacle, control. And yet, his name survives. Before they gave you theirs. Not in glory, not in honor, but in tragedy. The tragedy of Sporus is not unique. That's what makes it terrifying. Every empire builds itself on invisible victims. Every throne is raised by hands that never leave fingerprints. Every tyrant has a Sporus, someone who didn't fight. Not because they were weak, but because there was never a door to escape through. In the modern world, we still see echoes of his story. He meant something. Children trapped in conflict, used as symbols. Queer bodies punished for existing outside of prescribed norms. Survivors of abuse reduced to hashtags or statistics. People rebranded, dehumanized, erased because their existence threatens comfort. And still, like Sporus, they're rarely asked one simple thing. What was your name? Maybe that's why Sporus' story haunts us. Because he never got to speak. Because his life was turned into a performance he never auditioned for. Because even now, thousands of years later, we're still trying to figure out who he was behind the silk. Behind the silence. Behind the stolen name. He lived. He endured. He died. But more than that, even if the world forgot him, and maybe that's the only way to honor him now, not by retelling the story of the emperor who mutilated him, but by remembering that, once, there was a boy who was made into a wife, paraded as a ghost, and finally chose his own end, just so he could have one moment of control in a life where everything else had been taken. His name was and that's all we truly know. But perhaps that's funnily enough.